Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today in this session we are going to have a discussion on the newspaper of 7th of May 2024. So let's begin with the list of articles first. Today for detailed analysis we have 3 articles, one on your editorial page, that is half-hearted climate change verdict. So this is regarding the recent Supreme Court verdict and we'll discuss in detail. Then another article on carbon farming, a very informative article, and we are also going to discuss some of the other aspects of carbon farming. And then Putin orders nuclear drills as NATO mulls troop deployment. Now here also we'll go beyond the article and try to understand the basic point of view of Russia and how exactly do we think Russia is going to act. So these are the 3 articles that we are going to have a detailed discussion on. Then after that, from prelims perspective, we have one article, and this is basically about understanding of something called as MRI. So what is MRI? We'll have a discussion here. And then from the perspective of some of the articles which we have been discussing, one with regard to the ceasefire acceptance of by Hamas, then the same thing, another article that we have related to the same proceeding, and then finally something related to the Uttarakhand forest fires. So these are the articles that we are going to discuss in today's news analysis. So let's begin with our first article that is on your editorial page, and this is a half-hearted climate change verdict. Now, what we saw recently, that the Supreme Court of India judgment, we see that they extended the constitutional rights to life and equality to also include protection from adverse impact of climate change. Now this recent judgment, it offers a very, you can say, glimmer of hope amidst all the escalating environmental crisis that we see around. Now with governments worldwide right now, you can say, neglecting all the scientific evidences that we are getting and facing imminent collapse in a manner from the rising temperatures, and this is something that we see as imminent. So in all that perspective, when we look at this ruling, it has a potential to catalyze some kind of meaningful action. But notably, especially when we talk about the courts acknowledge the disproportionate impact of climate change, especially on the marginalized groups, and also emphasized on the importance of safeguarding the interests of all these groups. However, despite all the positive aspects of this judgment contains some flaws, we can say. The judgment, for example, the court emphasized the importance of expanding the renewable energy to meet India's climate target. But at the same time, it also overlooked a lot of critical challenges. So this is basically what we have seen, that at least more importantly, we have seen that it emphasized that marginalized communities suffer disproportionately from the impact of climate change. And what we have to understand is that there are certain things that are being overlooked. So where we are saying that there are some critical challenges that we probably will face. If you take an example, large hydroelectricity power plants and nuclear projects, they are considered as part of non-fossil fuel energy. They are all called as non-fossil. Instead of calling them as directly as renewable, we call them as non-fossil. And once I had discussed with you also a month back about why large hydroelectricity power plants and nuclear power plants, they are not really considered as completely renewable in its nature, but they are considered as non-fossil. Very often whenever governments around the world, when governments talk about these kind of resources where you're either talking about large hydroelectricity power plants or nuclear power plants, you'll always see that they talk about these sources and they mention them as non-fossil fuel energy. Now this is something which is also associated with very significant environmental and social problems as well. For example, we know that a large hydroelectricity power plant can lead to habitat loss, and at the same time it also leads to community displacement. Additionally, the expansion of also, let's say, the large scale solar and wind projects, they also displace local communities and they also disrupt wildlife. And we have seen examples of that as well. So, for example, we have seen that the cases, let's say, when we take the cases of Rajasthan. So, these kind of plants that we have in Rajasthan, in the context of Rajasthan, we often talk about the Great Indian Bustard. The Great Indian Bustard, right? And we know that there have been instances of these critically endangered species also losing their lives because of electrocution. So we have seen that many of these projects, which are very large in their scale, they in one manner or the other, they cause some disruptions environmentally and socially as well. Another example is Pavagada Solar Park that we have in Karnataka. So this particular solar park, it has displaced a lot of local agriculture, while the proposed, if we talk about another plant that we have in Ladakh, another one that has been proposed in Ladakh, the Changtang project. Now the Changtang project also has threatened a very fragile ecosystem that exists in Ladakh. So that's why we have seen that there have been these kind of problems. So when we say non-fossil fuel, so understand this meaning, and we had discussed this once, I'm discussing this again. The main problem between what is renewable versus what is non-fossil is that non-fossil might have environmental and social impacts more than usual renewable energy sources, and that's why many a times sources like nuclear energy or large hydroelectricity power plants, they are often called as non-fossil systems rather than renewable systems. So that's why we have seen that there have been certain examples where we have seen the problem. So one, as I told you, is in the case of Rajasthan. Another is the case of Pavagada solar plant in Karnataka. And another one can be the Changtang project that we have in Ladakh. So that's why we have to understand that there are all these cases where even though they are not fossil, yet they are causing these problems. So that's why what happens here is you have to understand that these projects, they often bypass the environmental impact assessments, and that's why it leads to unchecked consequences. And in one of the analysis, I also had discussed with you the importance of environmental impact assessment. That why environmental impact assessment becomes important, because every time there is a large project being undertaken or large infrastructure project that we have to approve, before that the government goes with the process of environmental impact assessment to understand the ecosystem, to understand the flora and fauna, and the kind of impact a new project might have on a given ecosystem or a habitat. So that's why environmental impact assessments are done. But unfortunately, many times what happens is, or rather as a rule, we know that there is an exemption that has been given by the EIA rules in India to the renewable energy sector. So that's why if a large solar power plant or a large wind power plant has to be established, then in that case, they don't need to go through the entire process of environmental impact assessment. So that's why there are these kind of issues that we very often see. Then, moreover, if we see, despite significant renewable energy investments that we have seen, the government still continues to also approve new coal mining projects also. And this is also, in a manner, you can say it undermines India's commitment to clean energy. However, the things are not that simple. Many a times when it comes to coal-based energy in general, we know that coal-based energy, we want to reduce as much as possible. But right now, currently, we are not in a position where we can just overnight stop the use of coal. And that's why it becomes very, very also crucial for India also to keep adding to the capacity that we have with the renewable energy sources or other non-fossil sources. So whether it is solar energy or wind energy, or whether it is biofuels, or whether it is nuclear energy or hydroelectricity power plants, in all these cases we will have to first increase our total capacity with all these sources, then only we'll be in a position to keep on reducing coal further. Because otherwise, electricity right now, about 65% of electricity production still happens with the help of coal. So it's not that easy that overnight we can just like that we can just stop using coal and start using all the non all the renewable and non-fossil sources. So that's why there are these concerns that we have. And in this manner, when we look at the court's uncritical endorsement of the current energy transition, it overlooks some of the viable alternatives. For example, the decentralized and rooftop renewable energy sources. These kind of options, they potentially provide over 600 gigawatt, and that's why they could also very well align with the principles of equality and environmental protection. So that's why there are these kind of things, that decentralized and small scale renewable energy solution, they can become crucial. So that's why in this context, when we talk about the recently launched rooftop solar energy projects, they can become very viable option in this context, and they have a huge potential in India. At the same time, the judgment also, you can say in a manner, did not address the wasteful consumption of energy and that the need that we have for efficient demand management as well. The judgment also missed an opportunity in a manner to also integrate a growing international legal framework on the rights of nature and indigenous communities that also very often are in direct line of conflict with many of these projects. So that's why these kind of efforts could bolster the effort to to protect the marginalized groups and also the environment. And the expert committee established by the court, it could be tasked with assessing alternatives which are less damaging. So having less damaging ways of meeting energy needs while also reducing the waste and the luxury consumption that we see in certain sectors. So there are all these things that could be done. So that's why growing international legal frameworks can be looked upon when it comes to the rights of the nature and the indigenous people. And then at the same time, the heavy reliance on major project fundamentally also violates the constitutional rights to reforestation and displacement. So that's why we have to understand that the judgment should also prompt a broader re-evaluation of India's development model, which very heavily relies on environmental destruction, correct? Environmental destructive mega projects that violate the constitutional rights of people. So for example, the government's proposed deforestation of almost 130 square kilometers in Great Nicobar for development could devastate the region's indigenous communities. The court has to come forward and try to compel the government to reconsider such projects to ensure the protection of environmental and social rights at the same time. And ultimately, the judgment holds the potential for transformative change, but at the same time, it also risks reinforcing a flawed approach if these critical aspects are not addressed properly. So that's why there are these things that we have to keep in mind when it comes to the basic understanding of everything around this particular judgment. That the judgment overall, I would say, is a very welcome step, and that is what the article also had talked about. But at the same time, we have to understand that it's not only about one step that needs to be taken in this direction, but rather a bunch of steps that we'll have to take to ensure climate sustainability and also social justice at the same time. Now coming to the next article that we have on page number 8, related to GS3 agriculture and environment. The article is, what is carbon farming? Now, before going to the details of what the article says, let's try to understand the term carbon farming. So carbon farming is a term that refers to the agricultural method that tries to enhance the uptake and storage of carbon dioxide in soil. Alright, so what does it do? Just understand this, that it is an agricultural method that tries to enhance the uptake and storage carbon dioxide through agricultural methods. Through agricultural practices. Alright, through agricultural practices. So, storage of carbon dioxide, sorry, just to add here, we are talking about soil. So, in the soil. So, enhancing the uptake and storage of carbon dioxide in the soil through agricultural practices. Now, what we know is that carbon dioxide is first absorbed by the plants through photosynthesis, right? We know that we have carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, so that carbon dioxide will be sorry, absorbed by the plants via photosynthesis. The roots and the other parts, then they decompose and they are also converted into soil carbon by microbes. So that's why this is something that happens. So we know that plants will use carbon dioxide from air and water from the soil to build carbohydrates, and these are required because they serve as food for plants, right? Now what we see is that plants will exude carbohydrates through their roots and feed the soil organisms. So you have the microbes, especially you have the soil microbes, which would work in this particular in this case. So we have the soil microbes which will work in this case. Now the plant matter and with it the carbon dioxide are thus, that's why they are stored in the soil in the form of organic matter, particularly what we call as humus of the soil, right? So the humus of the soil, particularly when we talk about the upper layer of the soil, which is called as humus, which we know is the most fertile part of the soil. So it has a lot of organic matter, right? It has a lot of organic matter. So humus, that's why carbon dioxide plus organic matter. Now what do we mean by when I say organic? I mean, organic is a term that you see in so many different contexts. So in general, when it comes to the chemistry of something called as organic, it means that it has carbon in it. Any carbon containing compound can be called as organic. So that's why essentially when we mean plants and animals, anything related to plants and animals, it will be called as organic, right? So it will be called as organic. So when we say organic matter, we essentially mean the remains of plants and animals. So here we are talking about plant matter, right? Here we are talking about the plant matter which has mixed carbon dioxide with it, and that forms the humus. Now we know that so in this particular scenario, this is what basically happens, and then the soil organisms, they release carbon dioxide through respiration, and that's why then carbon dioxide will again be released and then they will be absorbed by the plants. So in this particular scenario, we see that this is something that happens. So carbon dioxide from the atmosphere enters the soil through decomposing plant matter, the root exudes, and then after that the soil organisms, they feed on them. So that's why this is basically the entire process that we see. Now what we understand is that we know that carbon is very essential to life on earth, and it plays a very significant role in photosynthesis as well. Now in case of carbon farming, we see that there are a lot of different ways in which we try to do this, where we are trying to ensure that we can store carbon dioxide in the soil. We take up and store carbon dioxide in the soil, and for that there are a lot of different practices. As you can see, you can even pause here for a couple of minutes and just see all the different ways in which we are trying to find ways in which carbon farming can be made possible. So overall, when it comes to carbon, we do understand that carbon plays a very, very crucial role and central role rather in photosynthesis, in respiration, and in maintaining the entire carbon cycle. Now in farming, we know that farming is cultivating of the crops and raising of the livestock for food and other resources. So that's why carbon farming in a manner tries to merge these concepts by implementing regenerative agricultural practices to try and restore the ecosystems, try to boost productivity, and also try to enhance the soil health, while trying to also mitigate the climate change through carbon sequestration and reducing the greenhouse gas emission. So this is exactly what we mean. So integrates the regenerative agriculture to restore ecosystems, to increase productivity and to reduce emissions. Correct? This is basically what we are trying, and that's why the concept of carbon sequestration is also central here. What is carbon sequestration? Carbon sequestration is capturing and storing of carbon, or capturing and storing of carbon dioxide. Capturing and storing carbon dioxide, right? So there are all these things that we are trying to do, and that's why many a times carbon farming is also called as regenerative agriculture. It is said to be a form of regenerative agriculture. So now overall what we see is that there are various different practices that can be helpful in carbon farming. So for example, one thing could be rotational grazing. So in case of rotational grazing, what we see is that there will be a periodic movement of livestock to new pastures. Alright, so periodically livestock are moved to new pastures. Then after that there is agroforestry. So in case of agroforestry, we try to combine the trees and the shrubs with the crops or livestock. So that's why they offer practices like silvopasture or ally cropping, etc. So all these kind of things, they can be used in agroforestry, where we are trying to mix all these efforts. Then after that we have conservation agriculture, which involves zero tillage of the soil, crop rotation, cover cropping, and also crop residue management to try and minimize the disturbance to the soil. So that is why it is called as conservation agriculture. So zero tillage, crop rotation, cover cropping and residue management. These are four basic pillars of conservation agriculture. Similarly, there is also an approach of integrated nutrient management. Integrated nutrient management, where we use organic fertilizers and compost to try and promote soil fertility. So organic fertilizers and compost to promote soil fertility or soil health. Then after that there is the concept of agroecology. So agroecology, it includes crop diversification and intercropping, which would try and improve the entire ecosystem resilience. So that's why crop diversification and intercropping systems are used in agroecology. And then also livestock management. So when it comes to livestock management, we are trying rotational grazing, we are trying to optimize the feed quality, and also trying to manage the waste to reduce the overall emission from these perspective. So reduces emissions via rotational grazing, optimized feed and waste management. Now why are we talking about waste management in this case of livestock management? Because when it comes to the decomposition of waste in natural ways, a lot of methane emission happens here. You'll see that a big proportion of methane emission worldwide is from animal waste. So that's why if we can reduce that waste, if we can better use that waste, then in that case perhaps we'll be able to reduce the amount of methane emission that is happening right now. And methane as a greenhouse gas, just remember this, that methane as a greenhouse gas is far more dangerous compared to even carbon dioxide. 25 to 80 times more dangerous as a greenhouse gas as compared to carbon dioxide. So that's why if we are able to manage the emissions of methane, it will do wonders for our environment. So that's why there are all these key practices that we have when it comes to carbon farming. Now coming to some of the challenges that we see. First, we have to understand some of the geographical factors. That when it comes to the climate and soil conditions, they very significantly affect the effectiveness of carbon farming. And that's why we understand that varying soil and climate, they affect the effectiveness of climate farming, because we know that with climate change, with global warming, the amount of carbon dioxide is also increasing, the amount of greenhouse gases is also increasing. So then offsetting that becomes even more difficult, and at the same time there are certain shifts in weather patterns, etc. also, that also lowers the effectiveness of carbon farming altogether. Then after that, the problem of water scarcity. the limited water availability, it can very easily hinder the plant growth, and particularly when it comes to the arid areas, this is something that can lead to a lot of problems. So that's why limited water in dry areas, it hinders carbon sequestration as well. It hinders carbon sequestration because it leads to stunted growth, you can say, or it hinders plant growth also. Lesser, or rather poorer plant growth. Poorer plant growth also. Now, apart from that, plant selection also is something that matters, that not all the plants can sequester carbon equally, and that's why choosing suitable species becomes very crucial, becomes very vital. So suitable species are essential for optimum sequestration because not all plants are equal in carbon sequestration. Then after that, there are some financial barriers as well, because there are small scale farmers who may lack resources for sustainable practices. So that's why they also we have to ensure that we can provide the resources, we can provide them the resources for sustainable practices. All right, for sustainable practices. Then after that, we have to understand the perspective of policy and support requirements as well, because we know that it will require government policy support, community engagement, and also financial financial assistance at the same time. So it requires government policy, community engagement, and financial assistance. So that's why when we look at some of the global initiatives in this particular area, we have seen that in certain areas there have been some development that we have seen. So for example, one case study is of Chicago Climate Exchange, where it tries to promote no tillage farming, reforestation, and pollution reduction at the same time. So focuses on no till farming and pollution reduction, and at the same time reforestation also. Reforestation. So these efforts are being made. Then in case of Australia, there is carbon farming initiative that has been taken, which also tries to incentivize carbon mitigation activities. Then after that, in case of Kenya, we have seen that they have agricultural carbon project, where a World Bank backed initiative to tackle climate change and food security has been taken up. So tackles climate change and food security, and this is something that has been backed by World Bank. Backed by World Bank. Then after that, there is another initiative which is called as 4 per 1000, and this is something that encourages the carbon sequestration in soil to offset the emission. So encourages carbon sequestration globally, and this is something that is to offset the emission altogether. Now if we talk about India, that what kind of opportunities do we have in India when it comes to carbon farming, there are different things that can be done. So for example, when it comes to organic farming, the potential that we have for organic farming, the agroecological practices, they could generate up to $63 billion in value and annual payments for climate services. So just imagine the numbers that we are talking about. So agroecology can generate significant economic value and payments for climate services. Then after that, when we look at another aspect of regional stability, the Indo-Gangetic Plains and the Deccan Plateau, they offer very suitable conditions, while when it comes to the Himalayas and the coastal areas, they are not that conducive. So that's why the Indo-Gangetic Plains and the Deccan Plateau, they become ideal, they become conducive, and the other areas like Himalayan and the coastal areas, they are not that suitable. So that's why we see that there are these things. And then from the perspective of carbon credits also, India might want to incentivize the farmers and close the emission reduction gap altogether by doing that. So there are all these things that can be done, and so in conclusion you can say that when it comes to carbon farming, it has very significant potential to combat climate change with all the improving soil health that it can provide and generate a lot of economic benefits as well. But scaling it up will require addressing awareness, policy, and also technological and financial barriers to create an enabling environment for carbon farming to work. So that's it. This is about carbon farming. So just know everything, because today we see that there have been a lot of discussions around carbon farming and all the other organic practices and other something which is related, other practices, something which are related to climate change mitigation practices. In that context, these kind of efforts become very, very crucial. Now coming to another article, Putin orders nuclear drills as NATO mulls troop deployment. Now what do we see here? In the context of what has happened, the recent development, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has directed nuclear weapon exercise near Ukraine in response to the Western threats about deploying the NATO troops in this particular area. And this is an announcement that he made on Monday. Now, what Russia cited was that the recent comments that have come from the Western officials, this basically becomes the, you can say, justification for Russia, particularly the remarks that were made by the French President Macron and some of the British officials as well. And what we basically see is that there have been, I mean, obviously there have been a lot of movements that still are happening between Russia and Ukraine. We have still seen that when it comes to Putin's nuclear rhetoric, it is something that has it has intensified since what we saw when he launched something called as a special military operation back in 2022. So when they called it as special, military operation. Now in this context, what we see is that here it was also highlighted that there is a risk of, or a real risk of, nuclear war, is what it was highlighted by Russia and especially by Putin. Now here what we have seen is that Russia has emphasized that these exercises would include Russia's air force, the navy and ground troops also, which are stationed near Ukraine, and it is basically a direct response to the perceived Western threats from the side of NATO. Now in this particular context, what we basically see is that this is something which Russia basically has said that these threats are completely new rounds of escalating tensions, and that's why they suggested that they all these things, then it necessitates the unprecedented measures that they might have to take. So this is what the Russian side of the story is. Now the fact is, and what we need to understand is, that if we are talking that okay, there are nuclear drills that are being done by Russia, does it mean, or will Russia actually use nuclear weapons against Ukraine? Because since the invasion of Ukraine that happened, we have seen that the Russian President Vladimir Putin, he has repeatedly violated the international law, right? And no one wants to believe that nuclear weapons will be used, but as long as the nuclear weapons exist, they can be used. And this is what nuclear deterrence is based on. The credible, you can say, credibly threatening to mass murder civilians with the nuclear weapons. Now this basically is terrifying, but the reality of the situation is that we do not know for certain if Putin or any other leader who has a nuclear weapon will use nuclear weapon at any time. We do not know. What we do not know is that whether the nuclear weapons they pose any unacceptable humanitarian consequences, correct? We do know that this is something that is going to be disastrous, correct? And that's why there is no response capacity to help the survivors in the aftermath at all. Now that's why when we look at Russia, how many nuclear weapons do you think Russia has? it is just under 6,000 nuclear weapons, and right now that's why it is the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and that's why they can launch the nuclear weapons from land-based missiles, from submarines, or even from their airplanes. And when it comes to Russia, the Russian nuclear weapons, they range widely in their destructive yield, from the weapons equivalent to hundreds of kilotons of TNT, something which is so called tactical nuclear weapon, that mostly range from about 10 kilometers to up to 10 kilotons to up to 100 kilotons. So that's why when it comes to Russia, we know that they have approximately 6,000 nuclear weapons. They have 6,000 nuclear weapons, and in this context we have been talking about something called as the tactical. We have been talking about the tactical nuclear weapons that they have. Now when it comes to these tactical nuclear weapons, they basically range from 10 to 100 kilotons. 10 to 100 kilotons. Now the use of even one of the, even if you call it as a smaller nuclear weapon, it would have a devastating humanitarian consequence. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima and killed approximately 140,000 people by the end of 1945, we see that it was done only with a yield of 15 kilometers. That is the size of one of the smallest weapon that Russia has. So that's why we have to understand these tactical nuclear weapons, because very often whenever these kind of drills will be done by Russia, you will hear this term tactical nuclear weapon. So when we say tactical nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon is any weapon which has not been classified as strategic under the US-Russian arms control agreements. So there have been 3 such agreements. So just understand, when it comes to weapons, there are 2 kinds of weapons, one called as tactical and the other one called as strategic. Tactical weapons and strategic weapons. Tactical weapons basically are the ones which might actually be used in the time of a battle. So during battle or during war. And strategic missiles, or let's say strategic weapons, are those which are actually much more dangerous, which have a huge capacity. They could be nuclear capable, they might have a very long range. Alright, so these kind of ones, they are called as strategic. So very often that's why they'll say that okay, we are going to use tactical nuclear weapons and not the strategic ones, and that's why there are different agreements so that these strategic ones are not being used. And especially there are 3 such agreements, which are SALT, SORT and START. SALT, SORT, START. So these are parts of the agreement that we have between Russia and the US, so that the arms control, these are arms control agreements against strategic missiles. So the deployed tactical weapons in Europe, they can have explosive yield of up to 300 kilotons, which is basically 20 times that of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Sometimes these weapons are, that's why often referred to as also sub-strategic or non-strategic, and more frequently what we have seen is that when it comes to the term tactical, the tactical nuclear weapons, they imply that the weapons that were designed to be used on the battlefields of Europe during the Cold War era, they are called as tactical. So that's why, as I told you, tactical is something that will be used during war. And in the last century, what we have seen is that they have been deployed across the continent in case any kind of conflict happens between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, that basically were to escalate, if at all anything was to escalate between NATO and the non-NATO members, non-NATO countries. So that's why at the end of 1980s, what we saw was that there were around 7,500 of these weapons that were deployed throughout Europe. But what we have seen is that the mutual unilateral reductions that took place in early 1990s, it brought down the numbers significantly down. And there is something called as the Federation of American Scientists. They currently have estimated that Russian non-strategic nuclear warheads, right now could be approximately at 2000 being the number, and US the number for the US the number being 100. So, and 100 of the US non-strategic warheads, they are deployed in the European countries, different parts. There are 5 different European countries where they have been deployed. So that's why right now there will be a lot of discussion around tactical nuclear weapons, but we have to understand that even if somebody says that we are talking about smaller nuclear weapons, these smaller nuclear weapons also we have to understand that even if we are saying that it's 10 kilonewton, which is small, we discussed that the one that was dropped on Hiroshima was just 15 kilonewton, and it not only killed more than 1,40,000 people, but at the same time we saw that the upcoming generations also were affected. The children who were born after this were also affected. So that's why there is nothing that we can do once the weapon has been used, and that's why we have to understand the value of not using such weapons. Now coming to the article today that we have for Prelims Perspective, and this is about understanding the science behind magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. Now when it comes to MRI is a very vital non-invasive tool for viewing the internal soft tissues such as the brain, the heart and the joints. Now the foundation of MRI was laid back in 1970s, and in 2003 the Nobel Prize in Medicine for 2003 was also given for MRI. Alright, so that's why we see that in 1970s it was invented, and Nobel Prize in Medicine was given in 2003. Now let's try to understand how exactly does MRI work. Now when it comes to the working of MRI relies on hydrogen atoms. Hydrogen atoms that are prevalent in water and fat throughout the body. Alright, so that's why just try to understand how it works. So what we know is that it relies on the hydrogen atoms in water and fats all throughout the body. Alright, all throughout the body. Now when it comes to how it works, the patient basically would lie inside a cylindrical MRI machine where a very powerful superconducting magnet creates a stable magnetic field around the body. So this is basically what happens, that if you look at this picture, so we have this very strong magnet, alright, and this is the cylindrical tube. This is the cylindrical tube and the patient table, as you can see. So this is the cylindrical MRI machine, and it has very powerful magnet, superconducting magnet. It creates a stable magnetic field around the body. Now this magnetic field, it aligns the hydrogen atoms spin axis. Alright, the hydrogen atom's spin axis is aligned with the help of the magnetic field. So this is basically what happens. So first what we are doing is that there is a powerful superconducting magnet. So powerful magnets, they align the spin axis of hydrogen atoms. Alright, now what basically happens is that a device basically will send radio frequency pulse that excites a small portion of these atoms, and this causes them to emit energy as they return to their original state. So in this case we have the radio frequency coil. Alright, so a radio frequency coil basically will send pulses, and these pulses, they excite the small portion of these atoms, the hydrogen atoms. Now what happens is, when we say excite, when we say that this would excite, to excite basically means to increase energy, of atoms. Alright, so we will be sending small radio frequency pulses, and these pulses, they will take some of the hydrogen atoms and they would increase their energy, and this causes them to emit energy as they try to return to their original state. Because just remember that when it comes to any atom, just being a bit scientific here, when it comes to any atom, there can be two types of energy states that they can have. Either they are in their normal state, what we can call as the original energy state, normal state, and the other one can be excited state. Other one can be the excited state. Sorry. Excited state. So excited state means that this has more energy than usual. More energy than usual. And more energy than usual, having more energy than usual means that this is not stable. So they would want to lose that energy. They would want to emit that energy and return back to the original state. So this is exactly what happens. So we have the radio frequency coil, and this radio frequency coil will send some pulses, and these pulses will excite the hydrogen atoms. So the energy level of hydrogen atoms will increase, but this is not stable for hydrogen. So they would emit the extra energy and come back to the original state. Now this energy, this is detected and processed by a computer, and that's why it will be able to form a detailed two-dimensional or three-dimensional image. Alright, so that's why this energy just remember this, that this energy will be processed. This energy is detected and processed using computers to create two-dimensional or three-dimensional images. Two-dimensional or three-dimensional images. So in this context, this is basically what we see when it comes to using of the MRI. So that's why it uses hydrogen atoms prevalent in the body to create detailed image of internal tissues. So this is basically what happens, that strong magnet aligns hydrogen, radio frequency pulses, they excite them, and emitted signals, they generate two-dimensional or three-dimensional images. Now what are the advantages? When it comes to MRI, the MRI's strong magnetic fields and the three additional gradient magnets which we are using here, they allow for very high precision imaging from various different angles without even moving the patient. And the technique can differentiate the tissue types also based on the variations in the relaxation time, which also helps in distinguishing between the different types of tissues. So that's why when it comes to the procedure, this procedure also, very importantly, it's also generally safe, and it doesn't have any long-term health risks. For example, the kinds of problems that we have with X-rays, or the problems that we have with different radiation therapies, compared to that, MRI does not pose that kind of a problem. So that's why detailed high precision image from multiple angles, effective for diagnosing cancers, neurological conditions and cardiovascular tissues, and it is safe with no long-term health risks. Just understand that whenever it comes to long-term health risks, these are often problem, they can often be a problem with high energy electromagnetic radiations like X-rays or gamma rays. So X-rays or gamma rays, but here we are not using X-rays or gamma rays, we are using longer wavelengths which are generally safe. So that's why in this context we see these advantages. But when it comes to some of the problems, some challenges that we are still facing, MRI machines, they are expensive, and the cost right now is passed on to the patients, and that's why when it comes to the scans, these scans are very costly. And especially for those who require multiple scans, it can be very problematic with regard to the cost. And the patients must also remain very still during the scans, which may last for 10 minutes or even more. So that's why it poses a lot of discomfort, particularly for those with people who have, let's say, claustrophobia. And the machine is also noisy due to the high currents that are flowing through the superconducting wires, which also requires them to continuously keep cooling with the help of liquid helium. And while they are effective and very often essential, MRI scanning is also constrained by the cost and the patient tolerance, and that's why it limits its accessibility for you can say a wider use altogether. So that's why there are certain issues that we have with MRIs, but overall we do see that it becomes a very, very crucial option in the current scenario. Now coming to some of the revisited headlines, something that we discussed a couple of days back as well. Hamas accepts ceasefire proposal by Egypt, Qatar. Now what we have seen is that Hamas has accepted a ceasefire proposal that was facilitated by Egypt and Qatar. And this is supposed to end the 7-month conflict that has been happening between Israel and Hamas. The agreement basically has come just hours after Israel ordered 1 lakh Palestinians to start evacuating Rafah, potentially something that can foreshadow a ground invasion in Rafah. Although when it comes to Israel, hasn't commented on the deal yet, and it has and the details they have not been disclosed by Israel yet. And there are multiple phases where Hamas is going to release hostages in exchange for Israeli troops withdrawing from Gaza, and the ceasefire terms are right now not clear. Specifically, whether it will fulfill Hamas's demand for complete Israeli withdrawal, and whether it is a full end to the hostilities in this area. So we don't know that, and that's why, although it was conveyed by Hamas, the acceptance of Qatar's and Egypt's proposals, but we have to see where exactly it goes, because we saw that Palestinians celebrated in Rafah, believing that the agreement might prevent an Israeli attack there. But despite international pressure from allies like US against attacking Rafah, there is a potential for invasion. And that's why it has sparked concerns over the fate of almost 1.4 million Palestinians who are seeking refuge in Rafah. And humanitarian organizations, they have warned that further military action would completely, it would actually increase the Gaza's already dire humanitarian situation that we see there, and it might increase the total civilian deaths also, which already stands at almost 34,000 in the past 7 months. So we have to see where it goes, but this is where we see right now we are standing. Now another article related to the same topic. Biden speaks with Netanyahu, urges him not to launch offensive in Rafah. Now, the US President Joe Biden, he urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to avoid any kind of military offense in Rafah. And we know that when it comes to Israel, Israel seems to be advancing towards to target the Hamas militants there. But despite Biden's warnings, we have seen that Israel already has ordered the evacuation of approximately 1 lakh Palestinians from this city. But when it comes to the US officials, they were confirming the details of Hamas's position and whether it aligned with the agreements previously negotiated by Israel and the international mediators. So when it comes to some of the reports that we have seen, the reports from Egypt and Hamas sources, they indicated that the proposed ceasefire would occur in stages, and where Hamas, as we just discussed also, that Hamas might release the hostages in exchange for Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in certain stages. And when it comes to the Biden administration, they publicly pressed Hamas also to accept Israel's offer, which includes extended truce and the release of Palestinian prisoners who have been held in Israeli jails. Now, President Biden also emphasized his concern about an invasion in Rafah, where over 1 million displaced civilians right now are seeking their refuge. So that's why we have to see where it goes, and Biden also reiterated that a ceasefire would protect Israeli hostages who have been held by Hamas here. So this is basically where we are right now. Although we see that Netanyahu has refused to yield to international pressure for a ceasefire, and he declared that Israel will defend itself regardless of any kind of external opinions. So that is where we are. This is what the status quo right now is. Now coming to the last article for the day, Supreme Court to urgently hear petitions on Uttarakhand forest fires. Now the Supreme Court will urgently try to hear the petitions on Wednesday concerning the ongoing forest fires in Uttarakhand, which petitioners have claimed are primarily man-made. Now what we see is that Justice B.R. Gavai's bench directed the petitioners, including some of the senior advocates like Rajiv Datta, to notify about the upcoming hearing. And Uttarakhand's Deputy Advocate General, he committed to also attending the hearing and also sought permission to present a status report in front of the court. And Mr. Datta, he criticized the state's handling of the fires, and he argued that the government actually has very inaccurately reported the decrease in incidents to the National Green Tribunal. And in this context, that's why we saw that Justice Gavai suggested including the Central Empowerment Committee also in the next session. And some of the recent reports, they have indicated that over 900 fires have occurred in Uttarakhand in the last 6 months. And this is something that has impacted at least 1100 hectares of forest. And authorities have identified at least 59 suspects and 290 unknown individuals who are believed to be involved in many of these man-made fires. So that's why we have to see where it goes, because what we have seen is that if you count since 1st November 2023 onwards, we have seen that there have been 575 fires which have been reported, and this all over 690 hectares. And yesterday what we saw was that the state recorded 20 additional fires and even one death that has happened from these fires. And the government, that's why, is responding with some of the strict measures, also has pledged to apply the Gangster Act and Uttarakhand Public and Private Property Damage Recovery Act against these kind of repeat offenders. And that's why we see that it was also announced that there will be disciplinary action that will be taken against any negligent officer, and also emphasize that the National Disaster Response Force and Indian Air Force are also going to aid in the firefighting efforts altogether. And coordination is also underway with IIT Roorkee to try and utilize cloud seeding for rainfall to try and help to contain these fires. So right now, that's why we see that there have been a lot of problems, a lot of incidents, and especially if you look at this part of the article, you'll understand that the numbers right now are very challenging, and it becomes very, very crucial for us to ensure that it can be controlled as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it is a huge disaster that we are staring at. Now, lastly, coming to the mains questions of the day, the first question is: discuss the implications of the recent Supreme Court judgment extending constitutional rights to protection against climate change, with particular focus on balancing the need for renewable energy expansion and environmental conservation. So we discussed in detail how exactly the Supreme Court, what all Supreme Court has said, and what are some of the gaps in the ruling and what needs to be done further. So in this question, that's why you should write a way forward also, that what all can be done, without trying to criticize the judgment a lot. Don't be very critical of the judgment, because this is a very welcome step at the end of the day. There are certain misses, so you write about the misses, you write about the way forward, that this could also be done in future, this should also be taken into account, this also could be done. So you write those points in this manner instead of directly criticizing anything. Discuss the concept of carbon farming, and its potential in combating climate change while enhancing soil health and economic productivity. So again, we discussed in detail about what is carbon farming and how exactly there are different ways in which it helps, the advantages that it poses. So there are all these things that you can write in this particular answer. So with that, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you very much for being here.